Good morning. It is Tuesday, November the 16th, 2021. We are gathered here today at the historic Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. And best of all, out of all my videos, this is the first time you get to see what I actually look like. We're going to visit some graves of some famous and infamous, as it were, persons who are significant in the history of Virginia. So, we'll start right now. And we have Sebastian the Wonder Collie here along for the ride today too. Say hi, Sebastian. Sebastian doesn't talk much. First here we have a man who really needs no introduction. This is the grave of Jefferson Davis, the first and only President of the Confederate States of America from about 1861 to 1865. Oddly enough, he was really not looking for the job of being President of the Confederacy. It just sort of landed on his lap and he ran with it. After the war, he was imprisoned in Fortress Monroe, which is down in the southeast Tidewater area of Virginia, and later released and was ultimately buried here. He's got his own big circle or special grave area here at the Hollywood Cemetery. Here we have the grave of Mr. William Barrett and his wife Margaret to the left. William Barrett was a Richmond tobacco farmer. He was born in Richmond, served in the Richmond militia during the War of 1812, but really didn't see a whole lot of action. He became a wealthy manufacturer of chewing tobacco. One time he was considered to be the richest man in Richmond. Now sadly, slavery was a thing back then, and he was a slave owner. Now, one of his slaves who worked at his factory, a man by the name of Henry Brown, actually escaped to freedom by having himself mailed to Philadelphia in a big dry goods box. Henry Brown later acquired the nickname Box. William Barrett died in 1871 when he actually set himself on fire. The morning of January 20th of that year, he was lighting his pipe and somehow managed to set his night clothes on fire and burn to death right there in his house. What a way to go. This is the tomb or private mausoleum, whatever you want to call it, of Louis Ginter. Louis Ginter was a prominent businessman, financier, real estate developer, hotelier, philanthropist, and all-around jack of all trades who lived in Richmond. He also held the rank of captain in the Confederate Army. He was originally from New York City, and he gained considerable fortune through his numerous business ventures and became one of Richmond's wealthiest citizens. Although, believe it or not, he lived a very austere and modest life. Never had a big house or anything like that. This is the grave, the obelisk grave of Fitzhugh Lee. He was a Confederate Army general, also the 40th governor of Virginia, a diplomat, and I guess after the war he redeemed himself enough that he was also a United States Army general in the Spanish-American War. He was a nephew to Confederate General Robert E. Lee. This is the grave of Confederate General Henry Heth. It looks like Heth, but it's pronounced Heath. He is best remembered for basically starting the Battle of Gettysburg by accident. He sent in half of his division into the town before the rest of the army was fully prepared. Later in the day, the Confederate troops did succeed in routing 2 Union corps, but at a heavy cost of casualties, including Heth himself. Now, Heth survived his battle wounds and continued to command his division through the remainder of the war, and briefly took command of the 3rd Corps in April of 1865 after the death of General Ambrose P. Hill. This is the grave of Dr. Hunter McGuire. McGuire was a surgeon in the Confederate Army. He was the one who had the unenviable task of amputating General Stonewall Jackson's arm after Jackson was wounded by friendly fire at Chancellorsville in May of 1863. He continued to attend to Jackson until Jackson's death from pneumonia a week later. After the war, McGuire founded the Virginia College of Medicine and for a while was president of the American Medical Association. This is the whole McGuire family plot here, highlighted by Dr. Hunter McGuire's stone. Here we have the grave of James Ewell Brown Stuart, better known by his nickname J.E.B, which was made up of his first 3 initials. J.E.B. Stuart was a major general in the Confederate Army. He was a cavalry commander. He fancied himself as a bit of a cavalier by wearing a gray cape with a bright red lining and a yellow sash as part of his uniform. He was mortally wounded at the Battle of Yellow Tavern on May 11, 1864, and then died the following day. Flora Cook Stuart, his widow, would wear black for the rest of her life in memory of her dead husband. Here's a stone commemorating both of them. Looks like several family members are buried here also. Here is one J.E.B. Stuart IV, Colonel, United States Army, who just died April of last year. And presumably his father, J.E.B. Stuart III, passed away in 1990. And here's a couple of children's graves. This one says, "Our little J.E.B, age 19 months, 14 days. It doesn't give a date of his passing. Here's one of Bonnie, daughter of, I can't make out what it says. Looks like somebody and Mary Brewer. Must be a family relation. Died at the age of 2 years, but again, no birth or death date. And another one, our little Flora, age 5 years. But no dates. This is the grave of Confederate General George Pickett. George Pickett is probably best remembered for his ill-fated charge on Union fortifications during the Battle of Gettysburg, July 3rd, 1863. It didn't go well, at least not for the Confederates. Later on, the next year, he was in North Carolina, and he had 8 North Carolinian soldiers who were found to be wearing Yankee uniforms. He had them all hanged for desertion. This, of course, did not sit well with the other North Carolina people, so he ended up fleeing to Canada in order to escape a court-martial. And it was his old friend Ulysses S. Grant, believe it or not, who actually came to his rescue and made sure that the court-martial didn't happen or any other prosecution. Pickett was married 3 times. His first wife died giving birth to their first child, His second wife was a Native American woman of all people, and she died within the year of their marriage. And his third wife was a young woman 18 years his junior, a lady by the name of LaSalle or Sally Corbell. It is said that he first met Sally Corbell when she was 9 years old. Okay, George, whatever you say. George finally died at the age of 50 years old. And right beside George here, we have the grave of his third wife, Sally Corbell. Pardon my shadow, but here we have a bench dedicated to the author Michael Shaara. Shaara was the author of the critically acclaimed novel The Killer Angels, based on the adventures of the soldiers during the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st through 3rd of 1863. It's presented to the Pickett Society by Stephen Lang. Stephen Lang is an actor who played George Pickett in the movie The Killer Angels. Here we have a cenotaph dedicated to the memory of Brigadier General Richard Brooke Garnett. A cenotaph is kind of not really a tombstone, it's more like a memorial, because the person is not necessarily buried where the cenotaph is located. Although in Garnett's case, he might very well be buried here. Follow. Richard Garnett was killed in the Battle of Gettysburg during Pickett's charge, July 3rd, 1863. Now, even though he was wearing an officer's uniform, in fact a general's uniform, he somehow got gathered up with all the other Confederate dead and was buried in a mass grave at Gettysburg. Later on, all these remains were disinterred, brought back here to Virginia for a more proper burial. So it is presumed that Garnett was brought back with him. So he's probably buried here someplace, they just don't know exactly where. And here we see a number of graves of those soldiers who were disinterred from Gettysburg and were brought back here to Virginia to be buried on home soil. Sorry about the guy with the leaf blower over there. Here we have the grave of President James Monroe, 5th President of the United States. He is one of 2 presidents buried here in this little area called President's Circle, although there's only 2 presidents here. James Monroe was the author of the Monroe Doctrine, among other things. Basically said that any intervention by a European power on any nation in the Western Hemisphere, that being North or South America, would be considered an attack on the United States. The capital of Liberia in Western Africa is named Monrovia. It is the only national capital in the world, other than Washington, D.C., that is named for an American president. Monroe was also the last president to wear the traditional powdered wig tied in a queue, a tricorn hat, and knee breeches that were the fashionable men's attire back in the late 18th century. He also had a law office in Fredericksburg, Virginia, which is currently the town in which I make my home. James Monroe. Now this tall stone is the marker for President John Tyler, who was the 10th President of the United States. He was also the first non-elected president, having taken over the office upon the death of William Henry Harrison in April of 1841. After his presidency, when the Civil War broke out, he was elected as a Virginia delegate to the Confederate House of Representatives shortly before he died, which technically made him the first U.S. president ever to commit treason. John Tyler. This is the grave of Matthew Fontaine Maury. Maury was a naval officer for the United States and then later for the Confederate Navy. He was a historian, astronomer, oceanographer, meteorologist, cartographer, author, geologist, and educator. He's one of the nation's first oceanographers who studied and documented ocean currents around the world. Matthew Fontaine Maury. Here at the foot of the monument lies a stone. It says Matthew Fontaine Maury, Virginia Huguenot, or Huguenot, depending on your American or French pronunciation. Born in 1806, died in 1873. A pathfinder of the seas. Scientist, oceanographer, educator, Huguenot Society of the founders of Mannequin in the colony of Virginia. Stone was laid here in his memory in, looks like 2013. Here we have the family plot of a family by the name of Reeves. The main stone here is that of Charles R. Reeves Jr., born January 25th, 1870, died May 27th, 1905, veteran of the Spanish-American War, and it says member of Company K, 4th Virginia Regiment, USV. Not sure what USV means. U.S. Volunteers, maybe? Help me out in the comment section if you know what that means. One of the more interesting spots in this cemetery is this 3-foot-tall statue of a dog, a Newfoundland to be exact, and it's all made out of cast iron. The story behind it is that a little girl by the name of Bernadine Reeves used to go into downtown Richmond and shop at a mercantile store with her mother. The owner of the mercantile had this stone or this steel dog, this iron dog, out in front of his shop, and the little girl would always be fascinated with it. She'd come in and hug it and pet it and pretend to talk to it and everything else. Well, sadly, the little girl died of scarlet fever sometime later, and the owner of the mercantile shop offered to donate the dog to be put by the little girl's grave, as you see right here, just because the little girl loved it so much, and it would always be there to stand guard over her. And to this day, the dog continues to stand guard over her. Now, there's a somewhat parallel legend that goes with this, and that is when the Civil War broke out, some people wanted to take the dog, melt it down, and cast it into bullets. Now, that seems a little odd because bullets are usually made out of lead and not out of iron. Maybe they meant cannonballs, I don't know. But the idea then was they moved the dog here to the cemetery. That way it would become part of a grave site and they could not remove it. Otherwise, that would be considered desecration of a grave. A lot of people always come here and leave little toys and trinkets for little Bernadine here. You see the mess of all the toys and all the coins that are on top of the doggie. What do you think of the doggie there, Sebastian? What do you think of the big dog? Cast iron dog, yeah. He don't smell like a dog, does he? He sure looks like one. What do you think? You didn't stay very long, did you? All right, I know you're bored. Let's go. Come here. And finally, we have one of the more recent celebrities in our visit here. This is the grave of Thomas Kennerly Wolfe Jr., best known probably by his first name, Tom Wolfe, the author, the writer. He passed away in 2018 at the age of 88. His first novel, The Bonfire of the Vanities, was published in 1987 and was met with critical acclaim. And he also became a commercial success. He was well known for his trademark white suit that he always wore and a fedora. You'll note the little fedora there on the Wolfe tombstone. In 1979, he published what might have been his most famous work, The Right Stuff, that told the story of the Mercury 7 astronauts in the early days of the United States space program. This book was made into a movie by the same name in 1983. Tom Wolfe. And that concludes our visit to the historic Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. I hope you had as much fun watching it as I did making it. Please consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll see you on the next adventure. This is the Tactical Panda, signing off.